Very good. Thanks for coming today, Jim.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So, universal basic income, why did that become so important to you?
So, a couple of reasons, honestly. I've spent most of the last 10 years working in the political space to some degree. I worked on the first Obama presidential campaign, spent a couple of years out in DC after that, working for him out there, and have been engaged to some degree ever since. But I would say 4 or 5 years back now, I started feeling concerned that when we were talking about what are the right economic solutions for the country, they tended to be pretty backwards looking, thinking about the traditional model as to you would, when you're growing up, you get an education, you find a job, you work in the same company for years, if not decades, and just count on that sort of stability as the way of providing you with your financial resources, with the benefits you need, and so on. And you don't have to imagine what the future will look like to know that that's no longer the case. We already have a situation where jobs have become much more fluid and dynamic. And there's a lot of pluses to that. It gives people, I think, a lot more freedom to figure out what they want. But the flip side is that we've lost a lot of that stability that formerly would come from that long relationship between employer and employee. And so when thinking about what is the right way to actually support people in the systems that we have, thinking about something that is outside the context of work. And so I don't even remember where I first heard about the idea of UBI, but when I first heard about it, my initial reaction is like, I don't know what I think about this. This seems weird to be able to just give people enough money to be able to survive. But then the more I read about it, the more I thought about it, the more I saw the evidence of has been out there that this is actually can be a really effective, powerful program, the more it made sense to me. And so, yeah, about 4 years back, decided, there's not enough conversation around this. I think I'm going to try to do some writing, to start some conversations here, and just see where things go. And that led to the formation with myself and a few other people of the Universal Income Project. And so have been continuing to do advocacy and policy work on universal basic income ever since then.
So, your background, you were with Obama and you were helping him rebuild the dream, so to speak. What was that like?
So that was the nonprofit organization that I had helped to start. I'd helped to start after my time in DC. It was with someone I'd worked with in DC, Natalie Foster, who ran the digital department for President Obama's Organizing for America. And so her, and then also Van Jones, who's done a lot of political work as well. And so the idea there was generally to try to push a bolder progressive economic agenda. We weren't actually talking about UBI at that point, but I think all of us recognize that generally the politics around the economy was pretty conservative, small c conservative, in that it wasn't thinking big enough. And so the goal of that organization was to try to foster a broader movement to push for bigger ideas in that space.
How do you do that? So, there's business, there's public, and then there's the nonprofit space. How do you move something as colossal as a country?
I mean, there's different ways of doing it. We would talk about inside game versus outside game. Inside game is you try to work with the people who are already in positions of power. So elected officials, highly regarded and established, community or nonprofit leaders, get them on board with different ideas, and then work through the traditional political channels to make that happen. So that's one mechanism. The other is outside game, which is relying on people power. And so it's much more like the Bernie Sanders or you could say first Obama presidential campaign model, which is if you can actually get enough people out there demanding change, then it becomes hard to ignore, and you can actually see our systems respond. And so depending on what you're talking about, one, the other, or both of those methods together can potentially be effective at actually getting change through. But it really depends on what you're asking for. It really depends on the moment. I think where we're at right now as a country, the inside game approach for anything substantial seems like pretty much a non-starter, just because of the inability to get anything done at the federal level. And so I think in this moment that outside game approach really getting people educated and then hopefully galvanized around the big ideas they're fighting for is a powerful way to go.
It seems a little counterintuitive that government's supposed to be helpful and kind of is hindering everything. That's a little bit of what I'm hearing. It's kind of like the extra heavy thing on the top that's toppling and ineffective.
I mean, I would say certainly in this moment, I don't think that that's necessarily or even always been true. I think that unfortunately over the last 20, 25 years, we've moved to a place where, uh, well, I mean, I am, my background is partisan and I'm partisan, but I would say
Say it,
that
go for it.
the,
We're not afraid of politics.
all right. The Republican Party, I mean, their tactic for decades now has been obstruction. That they've had a goal of making government less effective and then running on government being less effective. And so I think that a bipartisan system only works if you can have a reasonable degree of cooperation. And when you have one party that they've decided it's in their interest to not have things happen, it means it takes a monumental amount of effort to actually be able to do anything. And so I think that is the moment that we're in. And so as long as that's the case, I think that, and as long as Republicans control, I mean, any of the arms of government, I'm not sure that's about to change. And so in that situation, yes, I think we have to look to other places to be able to push through substantial change.
Is that a flaw or is that a design? Is that something that's inevitable? So when you talk about bi, it means there's two parties, which means it's kind of like two teams, which means it's kind of like a sport. Is that the problem? Because most places don't have that bipartisan system. They have something that works much better.
Yeah, I would say yes, generally, if we had something like a parliamentary system that did allow for the existence of third parties and fourth parties and fifth parties potentially, which could then work in coalition to be able to create a majority. I think potentially that could put us in a much better spot because basically we've been forced to, I mean, there's more than two different camps of people in this country, and we've been forced to make these odd alliances to form the parties that exist today. And so there's nothing inherent saying that a party supporting big business needs to be the party that supports evangelical beliefs or now white nationalism. But that is where we're at because that is basically what got pulled together to form the modern Republican Party. So I think that, were our rules to be different, we might be in a different situation.
Can we change it if the people that on top are incentivized to keep it that way because that's what got them there?
It's really tough. I mean, that's where you need massive, massive outside pressure to be able to make something like that happen. And I mean, there's plenty of precedent for this, both in the US and around the world, that if the people of a country feel strongly enough that they're not being represented, I mean, at the end of the day, the country is people. And so I think like what you're seeing right now in Hong Kong is an example of what it can look like when a population really decides that, no, we're not going to accept the screwed up system that we're in. And so what that looks like, I think is hard to say. Can you do it without violence? I think is a big open question. But I think that any one person with the current system, no, you're not going to be able to do much of anything. If we had millions of people working together to make something happen, then we could.
And that's what you're trying to do. Why did you choose the economy specifically?
I think that underlies so much of, well, everything in our society. And I think particularly if you're looking at poverty and financial insecurity, but poverty in particular, any of the challenges that we're dealing with right now are, if not fully caused by, at least made worse by people living in poverty. And so when you're talking about health, when you're talking about crime, when you're talking about even environmental stuff, that if you have a population that is financially secure and empowered, those things become much, much easier to solve. And so I think that there is, I mean, once you get to that level, it's systemic. And there is that interconnectedness between those challenges, and I think the economics are really at the center of that. And so it's not, and this is something I tell to a lot of people, that something like UBI is not going to solve every problem, but it can make just about every problem easier to solve if you can actually create that foundation, that economic floor for everyone.
Your IQ is like 10 points lower when you're worried about running out of money because
Yeah.
you got to hustle. When your back's against the wall, you just start shooting. Would you take, if you could choose between these two, which would you choose? A UBI or universal health care? And
I
that's not to say you should have to choose. A real nation in the first world should be able to do both. But let's
Yeah.
say you had to choose.
I really think it's not only that we should do both. I think that those complement each other so well, because UBI doesn't, if it's a UBI without universal health care, you still have the problem of outrageous medical costs and people going bankrupt because they can't pay their medical bills. So you haven't really solved the problem. If you have true universal health care without UBI, I mean, it means we're going to be a much healthier population, but you'll still have that financial precarity, which is going to like drive up mental health issues, lead to more health issues down the road. So I would say like very much both. Like these are not alternatives. As far as the order, um, I mean, honestly, whatever seemed more that we could get done more easily in the shorter term. I would say right now it seems like there's more momentum behind Medicare for all, and so if we can go ahead and get that through, great, let's do that.
Yeah, because
But
otherwise
yeah,
you still have the handcuffs. You can't leave your job, and if you do, you're screwed.
right.
Yeah, it's a super challenging problem, not in terms of what's obvious, but in terms of getting the political umph behind it, so to speak. How do we fund a universal basic income? There's been a lot of different theories on how to do this. There's some presidential candidates running on this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I come at it again very much from a progressive lens that I think that what I find helpful for myself and when talking to others is to say, like, let's take a step back when thinking about economics and say, because people say, like, oh, it's too expensive. And that's like, sometimes you can't even get past that in the conversation around the policy. But taking a step back and thinking about how much wealth our country has, that's really what the question is. Like, do we have enough resources to end poverty? And the answer is yes, we easily have enough to do that. Um, Not only do we produce twice as much food as we eat in this country, we have 6 vacant homes for every homeless person in this country, but our
We have 6
GDP,
vacant homes for every homeless person in this country.
yeah. And so those resources exist. So that's, I think, helpful to start with. As far as how do you work with our existing system to actually make that happen, I think that there's a couple of different ways that I like. The first is just working through our income tax code. One thing about UBI, a lot of the pushback that you'll get, particularly from the left, is why are we giving money to rich people? Because a true UBI is universal. Everyone's getting your check every month. Um, and I think there's very good answers around that. If you don't, if it's targeted, you don't give money to some people, you run the risk of then it becoming stigmatized. It feels like either charity or just welfare as opposed to just our just dividends that we're receiving because we, as a country, are creating so much wealth. Um, but I think what you can do, and which makes a lot of sense, is that when you're talking about financing, if you are adjusting our income tax such that once you get above a certain income, you're effectively just taxing that money away. So if you're not earning as much, you're coming out ahead, you're getting more from UBI. If you're earning more, you're paying more into it. And so if you adjust our income tax that way, and if you add some additional tax brackets on the top so that we go back more in line to the way we were taxing people pre-Reagan, you basically lower the cost of the program from something like $4 trillion dollars to something like $1 trillion. So that gets you most of the way there on its own. As far as the rest of the costs, I think there's a couple ways of doing it. I really like the idea of a financial transaction tax, So a small tax applied whenever stocks or dividends are being traded. Um, a carbon
God,
tax.
Wall Street would hate that. They trade by the
Oh yeah.
second.
Oh,
They're
totally.
just leeches on the economy.
I mean, so yeah, so much of the financial industry now it's just rent-seeking behavior. It's not adding any value. And so figuring out ways to both cut down on that and also to
But
get some.
you just basically
Yeah.
violated the you just basically pushed away the entire financial industry and all Republicans because you talked about raising taxes slightly even.
I mean, I think that there's, and that's I think a important point, which is because UBI can look very different depending on how you pay for it and who gets it and how it's given. You do have these different versions that some on the right may like and some on the left may like. For me, it's very important that this be something that's not leaving people on the lower end of the economic spectrum worse off. And so yes, that does involve raising taxes. And so uh, if that means that Republicans, at least the current Republican Party, is not going to get behind it, then I think that's just a question of fighting for longer term, building the coalition that will support it. Um, but then that can be supplemented by something like a carbon tax, something like a wealth tax as well, like Elizabeth Warren has floated, and that basically gets you the rest of the way.
Okay, so you wouldn't necessarily propose cutting back on existing welfare programs and using that to fund it.
I think that there's, well, two things. One, I think it's absolutely right that the way our social programs work today can and should be improved, particularly making them less paternalistic and so giving people more agency through them. Um, I think that it is not only very hard, but really impossible to know in advance what aspect of those the UBI will sufficiently replace and what it won't. Because there are so many programs, and some of them are very, very targeted towards specific issues that people are dealing with. And so, what I would like to see is to enact UBI that doesn't rely on cutting those programs for funding. And then once that's in place, to actually really launch a thorough review and research process to understand, okay, what's actually necessary and what isn't working in the safety net, and use that at that point to be able to reassess how to do it. I think because, I mean, we're doing a lot of pilots, we're gaining more and more understanding and evidence around the benefits of UBI, but we won't actually know exactly how it all plays out until we have rolled it out. And so I think that tearing down too much of our existing system prior to that is best avoided until we can actually really understand what is this world we're living in at that point.
The danger with that approach is that, at least with the US government, it kind of continuously grows, a bit like a cancer, in that it never gets smaller, it only ever gets bigger. And
I,
how do you handle something like that? If you add, but then have to delete later, you're going to be deleting jobs, deleting people's way of life, so to speak.
I mean, honestly, at least for the past few decades, it hasn't been true of safety net programs. Most of the direction has been in the direction of cuts. I mean, you had under Clinton welfare reform, which cut back on a lot of stuff, and there have been just like chipping away at things in the years and decades since then. So I think that when you're talking about uh, more universal programs and more and I would say more direct cash-based programs, there is more evidence that those are more politically popular and resistant. So you haven't seen that happen to Social Security, you haven't seen it happen to your income tax credit. But as far as the other programs that are part of the safety net today, it hasn't appeared, at least in recent times, that there isn't the ability to cut them back down the road, particularly if they don't seem like that they're doing a whole lot.
What's the best way to do pilots in terms of how we can effectively do this and see, is this something plausible? Yeah, talk riff about that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple of important things to consider with pilots. One is collecting the data that helps us better understand impact, and so I think there's definitely a role for more of that, particularly because, as I mentioned earlier, poverty and financial instability is such an underlying factor in so many other areas And so better understanding if you give people a basic income or something like a basic income, what does that mean not just for their economic well-being, but what does that mean for their health? What does that mean for the likelihood that they're going to enter the criminal justice system down the road? What does it mean for their education attainment? What does that mean for their entrepreneurial pursuits? Those are all potential areas where potentially there could be big, big differences with the UBI. And if we can use pilots to be able to better understand, okay, what's actually going to happen here, I think that's going to be really valuable data to have. I think another, and this is very much looking at it with my political lens, but there is such a knee-jerk reaction in the population at large that the idea of giving people something, particularly cash, without strings attached, just feels wrong and like things are going to go terrible. And so part of actually what I think is going to be important from pilots is the stories and be able to say like, look, here's actually what happens. You have this low income person who's like been scraping together a couple of jobs. When they get $500 a month or when they get $1,000 a month, they're actually like able to go and either get more education or like figure out what sort of job is actually going to be right and fully provide for them in a way that they can't right now because they just don't have either the economic or mental like available resources to do that. And so I think that if you can lift up more examples of that, then that helps you get past the knee-jerk pushback, which will be important. I think one thing that I hopefully will be able to do at some point, not just in future, but is expensive, is the idea of saturation pilots. And that's where, so the pilots that are happening now are randomized pilots. So basically you're taking some area, whether it's a city or a state, and you're saying, okay, we're going to pick 100 or 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 people scattered among this population, and we're going to give them a basic income for some number of years. And then you see what happens. That tells you something, but it doesn't tell you everything, because we know from other types of programs and from pilots abroad that there's a very different impact when everyone is getting a basic income as opposed to just one person or a small number of disparate people amongst some population. And so if we can actually do pilots where we're having an entire community receive a basic income, that is going to be able to tell us a lot more about what would ultimately happen if we were to be rolling this out to everyone in the country.
I completely agree, but I want to play devil's advocate. People win the lottery and manage to lose all of it and go back to their general level of happiness not long after, quite frequently. And a lot of it has to do with the concept or how people think about money. I would guess, or I would propose, that a lot of these changes might take longer than a single generation to propagate forward. So the reason why the rich stay rich and the poor stay poor, in addition to everything that's infrastructurally built in, is the concept they have around money in terms of scarcity and abundance. And I think you would probably have to change the way people relate to that before you change the behavior significantly.
I mean, I think that it's definitely true that just the cash that's not going to suddenly erase all these differences and put everyone on actually the same playing field. And that there are aspects of how you perceive the world, who your community is, that have major repercussions. I think that's all the more reason for figuring out a way to do these saturation experiments, because you gave the example of a lottery. A huge aspect of that is if someone wins the lottery, first, it's public, like generally people know. And so suddenly they have a ton of money and everyone in their network does not. And so you end up in this, I mean, honestly, pretty fucked up dynamic where like you suddenly are like, you're no longer like a part of the community in the way you were before. And so of course that's going to cause all sorts of negative effects because you basically, it's like putting this distance between you and those in your network. And then whatever sort of relationships you end up with where people expect you to like buy everything or whatever it is, I think it makes perfect sense that you would see some pretty odd and negative outcomes from that. If you have a situation where everyone won the lottery, and obviously it wouldn't be that much money, but if suddenly everyone's in the same boat where you're all more financially secure, I think that looks very, very different than when you just have that single case. And so again, we're not going to be able to have a deep understanding of that until we can actually try it somewhere. But I think that potentially in that situation, things could change a lot more quickly than if you're talking about something at the individual level.
Who's the furthest along when it comes to these thoughts in terms of countries, locations, etc.?
It's hard to say. Yeah, one interesting thing about UBI is that there's some degree of movement in just about every part of the world, but people are approaching it in somewhat different ways. So, as far as where there's relatively recently been significant movement, obviously Finland with their pilot program that they did back in 2017-18. But then they elected a more conservative government who decided not to extend the pilot. So now it's unclear what will happen from there. Canada, they had Ontario was doing a pilot, but again, like Finland, they ended up electing a more conservative government that ended up canceling it. But as a result of that, their choice to cancel it actually got people much more engaged around the issue than I think they were before. And now there's a lot more popular demand to reenact or to create something like this, not just in Ontario, but in various places across Canada. And there are people at the federal government level there that are talking seriously about it. India, it's actually a result of a pilot program that they did to provide financial support for rural farmers. That was very, very successful. And suddenly after that, people are like, maybe the idea of everyone just getting money makes a lot of sense. And so there's a state there called Sikkim, which the government there has said they are going to roll out a UBI. They haven't figured out exactly what that looks like yet, but they're aiming in the next couple of years to make that happen. You have some innovative programs happening in South Korea. You have serious conversations in the UK. Scotland in particular has been pushing hard for this. And then, I mean, a lot of stuff around it has happened in the U.S. And as we talked about, there's not a whole lot's going to happen at the federal level for us at this point. But it's not crazy to think that some state or other would not enact a full UBI, but do something maybe like what Alaska does, where they create a big wealth fund that pays everyone an annual dividend or something like that. So I have no idea who will be first, but I think the fact it's happening in so many places is a really positive thing because it ends up being reinforcing each other as we see progress there.
I know you've argued that we need it regardless of the effects of automation and robotics. Where do you see us headed in that direction in terms of job growth, job loss, etc.?
Yeah, I'll be honest. So when I started looking at UBI, I, as with many people, was very much thinking about the automation framing and the idea that whether it's in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, most jobs will end up being replaced. And we may be in a society where there isn't enough jobs, at least in a current understanding of them, for most of the population. I think I've backed off from that to some degree. I still think, and I would say like anyone who's paying any attention should agree that the impact of technology is going to massively disrupt, has already disrupted and will continue to massively disrupt the way that jobs work. Whether or not we can come up with creative new types of employment for people, maybe. I think there's potentially a lot of interesting things in the experience economy that people could come up with, where while you could have a robot or computer program taking on any particular goal you wanted to achieve, just the act of being a person and being involved in providing experiences could potentially be seen as valuable. But I think, again, things are being and will continue to be massively disruptive. And so the way I like to look at it in that context is UBI gives people resilience. It's having that unconditional income floor means that you are just much, much, much better able to handle any curveballs that get thrown your way. And I think there's going to be so many curveballs that are coming up that's why a UBI will be, I think there's a good reason to think it won't be sufficient to handle everything coming, but it will be necessary if we actually want to have a population at large that's able to deal with this transition.
When you say necessary, do you mean revolution if we don't have it otherwise?
I mean, I have no idea what that looks like. I mean, maybe a revolution. Maybe it means, yeah, I don't even know. But I think it would be, without some proactive steps, I think we're talking about some massive, massive unrest.
I would totally agree. I want to play devil's advocate a little bit on the UBI.
Yeah.
Let's say we give people more money. What stops businesses from just charging more?
So that all depends on whether we have a functioning market. Because if we do, and we can rely on supply and demand, that's not likely to happen. Because basically you have competition amongst businesses, and that will keep prices basically like near the level of what it costs to produce the good or service. If we don't, and we have either monopolies or collusion between companies, then that's a possibility. And so I think that's another area where, along with things like universal healthcare and dealing with climate issues, we actually need to make sure that we're moving, or basically retoothing our antitrust laws in this country, such that when you do have these monopolies, when you do have companies that are price setting, excuse me, when you do have companies that are price setting, you have a way to be able to have the government come in and say, like, actually, no, like, this needs to be a competitive market, and taking action to address that. And so I think that is going to be an important thing to be looking at it as we talk about this, because I think something where you can see a functioning market right now is around food. Like, if everyone's getting an extra $1,000 a month, if McDonald's tries to double their prices, Burger King will say, like, well, we're only going to raise our prices by 50%. And then the taco place around the corner is like, oh, we're going to only raise our prices by 25%. And then basically that competition brings it back down to more or less where it was before. But areas like the medical field, the housing industry, I think those are ones where it's going to require thinking critically about what the dynamics will be and making sure that we're prepared to be able to step in, we being the government, if there are cases where companies are abusing that.
Yeah, the last thing we want is all the money just to go into real estate, which funnels it even more tightly. Right. So let's take this similar question from a different lens. How do we think about immigration, and how do countries think about immigration if they start to have UBI and other countries don't?
So, I mean, that's definitely a common reaction and concern is, oh, are suddenly like people are just going to flood here? The evidence around what causes people to try to immigrate suggests that whatever sort of benefit programs you have in a country don't have that much impact. It's people fleeing something. That's what causes people to come. And then the prospect of being able to get a good job and build a good life for yourself. But it doesn't seem like that there's, from the studies that have been done, that there's a whole lot of evidence that providing people with like a substantial safety net does a whole lot of anything. As far as, I mean, I think that there's already questions that need to be figured out around, like, yeah, what is our process here? What is our process around things like asylum, things like refugees, things like H-1B workers coming in? And I think figuring out something that is welcoming but sustainable is important. But I think expecting UBI to suddenly make that look very different, I don't think that's probably going to be the case. I think the challenge will look a lot like it does today as far as figuring out what's the right thing to do there.
Maybe I feel like that shifts the equation a bit, though. It's like when you only have so much space, you only have so much in terms of incentivization. Are you going to go to country A or country B, which is roughly equivalent but gives you 12 grand a year?
I think if that were the calculus being used by people, that would make sense. But as I understand it, it's more like shit, like local gangs and cartels are like destroying my life. I got to get out of here. Like, where can I go?
For asylum, not so much for legal immigration, though.
Well, for legal immigration, I mean, if we're talking about like H-1Bs, like those are people coming in with jobs, and so maybe that's a factor. But I mean,
And
those are
this
people.
isn't just for the
Yeah,
U.S. This is just in general.
yeah,
Like, let's say Norway enacts one.
hmm
Let's say the country surrounded by lots of other countries enacts one. I
yeah,
know, I know right now immigrants, at least in Europe, they go to countries that have good health care, countries that have
yeah.
strong social safety nets. They're going to Switzerland. They're not necessarily going to the Balkans.
Um, yeah. I mean, I think that. I mean, how much of it is a safety net versus how much is that there's the prospect for being able to find a good job and like build a good
But
life for yourself.
if you don't need the job, and the job is just icing on the cake. I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm very, very much in line with UBI and
yeah,
thinking
yeah.
we need that, but we gotta sort out some of those theoretical problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a question worth investigating more as far as like what is what are the motivations going to be and how where people would choose to go. But I mean, I would say if we can like actually get ourselves to having a strong functioning immigration system, um, having more demand to come to a country isn't a bad thing. I mean, that means you're doing well, and so it's just a question of then, okay, how do we how do we handle it in such a way that for people trying to come here, we're compassionate but also mindful as to what they're going to be doing and so on. And so I think that there's definitely questions to be had there, but my firm belief is that having saying we shouldn't have better systems to avoid attracting immigrants here is the wrong way of looking at it. We should have a good immigration system and build its best systems as possible.
Definitely agree. So you co-founded a good or a for good startup, ShareProgress, that helps other startups and businesses do great things in the world. Tell me a little bit more about that and how you think about the role of positive impact business going forward.
Sure. So yeah, Share Progress. I founded a company about let's see, 6.5, coming up on 7 years ago now. And the company has done a couple different things. The core thing that we do is we actually provide a software platform to advocacy organizations, those people who are doing grassroots advocacy, getting people to engage in some sort of ask, whether that's through petitions, whether it's through calling campaigns, whether it's through events to show support. And basically, they're tools that allow their members to turn into really ambassadors for a program and recruit people they know to get involved as well. And so it's something where as their members are taking action, they can be reaching out to their friends, and the tools allow the organization to be able to track that and also to actually be able to do controlled A/B testing around what sort of messages their supporters are sending and what's most effective at bringing new people into the organization. Beyond that, we've offered various consulting services, helping those types of organizations with anything from web design development to analytics, being able to track their metrics and do testing, to general strategy consulting.
What do you think about grassroots movements and the decentralization that we've seen in terms of blockchain and companies or organizations trying to be more user built and based?
I mean, I think there's a ton of potential there. I think it does tend to be very. I think it matters a lot on the context. I think there's cases where a really grassroots distributed approach really makes the most sense. I think there's cases where a top-down approach makes the most sense, and there's cases where it's some balance between the two. But I think there is if you have a model where um, people allowing people and encouraging people to really feel empowered in their own agency to be getting involved is a possibility that can really translate into much more impact because when people get into that mind state, they're willing to put in a lot more time and energy and potentially to be able to amplify what you're doing manyfold over as compared to what it would be if it was, just one person or set of people at the top making all those decisions.
Is that the future as we start to automate more and more jobs away?
I think it's part of the future. I mean, I think that it is. I very much believe in most cases of some sort of hybrid approach, because I do think. I mean, there's limitations to that. There's cases where, whether it's the existing structure that you're working with, whether it's the type of people that you have there, and what their background, knowledge, or skills are, that going full distributed may not get you where you want to go. You may not have enough coherence across the people involved. Um, but I think that it is. I think certainly traditionally there's been much more of the top-down approach on things, because we haven't had a lot of the tools to be able to do these more distributed approaches. And so I think that there's a ton of opportunity to engage more in that. And a lot of stuff we're still figuring out there. So, I certainly would expect and hope that to be a big part of it.
What technology or trend are you most excited about and why?
That's a good question. Um, I would say this is a little bit meta, but I would say people pay more attention to process. I think that traditionally there's been more the attitude. It's like, oh, like this is the way we do things, and like we'll figure some stuff out through this, but like generally this is how we approach doing new things or working on things. And I think bringing more of both a critical and innovative lens to saying like, let's actually think about how we run businesses or organizations, how we actually set up the things that we interact with in our day-to-day lives. I think that sort of those sorts of questions, that sort of exploration has the potential to really change the game. And I think it often gets overlooked because it is one step removed from the actual outcomes that people tend to pay attention to and think about. But it can have such a massive difference as far as how quickly you can do things, how whether or not you're getting to the best or near best answers. And so I think that innovations around process, that I think we've only touched the tip of the iceberg. But I think more people engaging on that, I think that there's honestly some really exciting potential there.
Do you have anything personally that you use for process in terms of making you perform at your best?
I mean, I think there isn't one thing I would say. Some of the practices I try to use is figuring out whatever I'm doing, how to do a good balance or alternate between kind of focused tunnel vision, just getting things done, versus step back, reassessing the landscape, deciding whether or not the approach that I or whatever group of people are pursuing is still the right one. Because I think oftentimes people end up in one of those two camps and just stay there. And I think that doing both is actually important to being most effective. Um,
How do we inject that experimentation into government? What I've heard mostly is that government could learn a thing or two from startups in terms of experimentation, testing, killing, etc.
yeah. I mean, I think that's true. I think that I think there's huge potential in that overlap, and there's also so much we have to figure out. I actually was having a really interesting conversation with someone the other day around design thinking. So going through a process of a design lab or whatnot, of trying to answer some big question, or as the case often is with startups, designing some product. And we now have these really innovative, effective techniques that have been developed within institutions that work on this. And so how does that then translate? Could you apply that to public policy and saying, okay, we want to come up with a policy for radically decreasing homelessness. in San Francisco or in California or in the US? Could we use design thinking? And the person pointed out that they had actually had some experience and said, look, there's a lot of good concepts here, but if you try to apply it directly, design thinking has been crafted towards product design. And public policy isn't a product that you're not just trying to serve a very specific market often, you're trying to serve the population at large. And so there's aspects of that that have huge potential, but if you try to apply it wholesale, it doesn't actually get you very far. And so I think that that's an area that is fascinating and deserves a lot of attention, is saying, okay, we have this thing that works really well here. There's some principles about it that we know are great. How does that actually then translate into this other world? And I think that's where the challenge is. But yeah, I mean, I think I see so much potential for being able to do things in a much more efficient and smart way if we can figure those things out.
30 years from now, what does the U.S. look like in terms of the mixture of capitalism and socialism?
What does it look like, or what do I think it should look like?
What does it look like? I know what you think it should look like.
I consider myself generally an optimist. So I'm going to choose to believe that we haven't had a complete collapse of the systems around us at that point. I think it is. I mean, if you're talking about the balance as compared to today, I think it's more socialistic than today. For the simple reason that, again, I think it's where it's helpful to take a step back and think about not think about this in terms of ideology, but think about it pragmatically and say that, look, markets are very, very effective for allocating scarce goods and resources. Whereas social systems generally are not as efficient, but are good if you want to be more universal in what you're doing. Because, I mean, markets work on scarcity. That's core to it. So any area where we can reach a point through innovation that we no longer have scarcity in the way that we used to, I think that's a system where then we should talk about, okay, does it make sense to adopt a more socialistic or centrally planned way of handling this, as opposed to a market-driven solution, which might have been much more effective in the past, but is not anymore. And so I do think that with advances in tech, I hope that we're going to see more areas where scarcity starts to disappear. And so in those areas, looking at more socialized systems.
How will we know when scarcity has disappeared? Because everything's a blurry line and you never see it because you're stuck in the trees. You can't see the forest.
I think this is why you can't really have an algorithm that answers all this for you. No, I mean, I think that's it's going to require. I think these are complex problems. I think these are things where there really isn't any way a priori to know exactly what the right answer is. It's something where we want to try things, see how it goes, and then adjust, try something else, and keep doing that until hopefully we can figure out systems that are getting us exactly where we want to be.
And if that doesn't work, I got a magic 8-ball. One last question before we jump to the lightning round. You're a very optimistic person. You've literally been smiling the entire interview. And I'm curious, what is it about you that makes you so optimistic and happy, and what can you share with the audience?
That's a tough one to answer. I think that the thing that just first comes to mind is I enjoy problem solving. And so when I see something not working the way I think it ought to be working, my reaction is, okay, what would it take? What can I figure out that could make this better? As opposed to saying, well, that sucks. And so I think that makes the bad stuff easier to deal with.
I like it. Find a way to look at it in a positive way. Guys, we're going to jump to the lightning round now. This is our patron-only bonus round where we have a couple of questions we ask Jim and all our guests on the topics of the best advice, the scariest technologies, the trends, where we're headed, all the good stuff. We do this because we need to make this show sustainable. If you want to get the lightning round, you want to get some extra bonus episodes and free bonus content, plus love, kisses, and hugs from me and the rest of the team. Disruptors.fm/Patreon. Support us at a level of $5 or more per month. Help us make this sustainable. Ready to do it, Jim? Back to the interview itself. What was it like working with Obama? What was the most interesting or unexpected thing?
Well, just to clarify, I wasn't working with
in the
him day to day. Yeah. One thing that surprised me honestly is when I was moving out to DC, I had in my head like I'll be working with a bunch of cutthroat political people who are not like don't have a better vision of the world. They're just in it to like get ahead. The people I worked with there, and I think part of this was because nearly all of them were people coming off of the Obama campaign, many of whom were new to politics, but they really shared a more idealistic view of like what our systems could be, and were just like generally nice, super pleasant people. And so, it was, I really enjoyed my time in DC. We were doing a lot of innovative work. Obviously things in the 2010 elections didn't go the way we wanted them to. But it felt like it was with good people doing like pushing the bars as far as innovative ways of engaging in politics.
What do you think about the recent crop of presidential candidates that are going to be running in the next election?
I mean, I think it's great we have so many. Obviously, there's some logistical challenges that comes with that. But I think we got some really good people in the field. I think that I really like that people seem to feel like they now have permission to be bolder in the ideas that they're embracing and talking about, which certainly was not generally true other than certain exceptions in the 2016 elections and before. It's interesting because I really have no idea where things are going to go there. But I feel pretty good about a lot of the folks involved.
So I'm going to twist your words and get your feedback on that. Donald Trump broke democracy to help build it better. Is that something you see possibly happening? Not that was intentional, but that's the
right.
end result.
I definitely don't think that was his goal there.
Oh, no, I don't think so as well. It was to show off the toupee.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that there is a lot of truth to that. I think there's a term I've adopted, which is from Naomi Klein, which is shock doctrine. Which is she wrote a book about this referring to 9/11 and basically how in this moment of crisis the Bush administration used that shock and disruption to push people into war with Iraq. But I think when you have those moments when things get blown up, that is a chance to change, and change can be bad or it can be good. And so I do think that this really is the 2016 elections and the continued Trump presidency have really created this moment where we can have serious conversations about how things might look very different than they do today. And so I do think that that's a good thing, and that there's a lot of potential good that can come out of that.
And let's say we got a universal basic income system functioning. You get your paycheck in the mail. What do you do in the next day? What does your life look like?
I think I definitely celebrate for like at least a few days. But as far as beyond that, I don't know. I mean, I think it's, as we talked about, it ties into so many other areas. And so if we've also gotten single payer healthcare, we've also done our antitrust reform, if we've also figured out how we're going to deal with climate change, then
that's a lot of ifs.
It's a lot. If not, I think there's continue to work. But if we've done that, then maybe I'll go and work on my game design projects.
Fighting the good fight, I like it, with a smile too. I got one last question before you tell people where to find you. I want one thing from you. It can be a quote, a call to action, anything. If you could leave people with one thing, what would it be and why?
I mean, I would say don't let the status quo stand in your way of imagining the world you want to build. Because I think that's far, far too common. And we need to actually be fighting for what we want.
I agree. I like it. I think it's beautiful. Jim, where can people find you?
So you can the best place to find me is just on Twitter, dr_Pugh, Pugh. You can find Universal Income Project at universalincome.org.
Very cool. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for
Yeah,
tuning
thanks for
in,
having me.
guys. And if he doesn't pull it off, Jim is going to send everybody free money. So you don't have to worry about anything. This has been the most profitable podcast in your history. Thanks for coming on, Jim.
Great to be here.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. If you do, share it around with a friend. It's the biggest, most important thing you can do for us because we're trying to reach more people and impact more change. We don't get a universal basic income unless we have a lot of people pushing for it. And we don't make big changes unless a lot of people push for it. So help us push. Disruptors.fm, share it around. Thanks.